Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our Perennials class. We're so glad you found it. You're able to join us. I know there's going to be others joining as we get started here. We've got just another minute, but I thought I'd get on just a minute early. Welcome you all. Some of you may be brand new to our classes. Some of you may have been coming to our classes before we kind of went to this online format. But thanks for joining today. Hopefully this will be a great class that you'll learn a bit about some of, well, I guess you could say some of my favorite perennials, plants that are going to work in any landscape, but primarily the focus is, of course, being more water efficient while creating that beauty and that attraction in a landscape. So kind of to introduce, Janice Terry is our garden lead. She is also joining our webinar today as a host. She will be addressing questions as they come up. So all of you with the Zoom, if you're unfamiliar with it, you've got a little set of a button bar on your controls, a Q&A button. That's the question and answer button. We're not going to be doing question and answer through any sort of raising the hands and allowing individuals to talk and video and stuff. It just gets a little too confusing, a little too chaotic. So if you have questions along the way, please just open up the Q&A little tab there, the little button, type in your question. Janice is going to be trying to address those questions as we go. And so all of you can see, you can kind of follow along if you have similar questions, they may be answered. So Janice will be addressing a lot of those questions as we go. If we get to the end and some of those haven't been answered, we will address more questions at the end of the presentation. And so we'll kind of proceed that way. And Janice is going to be on top of those Q&As the best we can. If you haven't got your answer yet, be patient. We will get to those questions and answers as we go. There's been a lot of interest in a lot of classes, and we appreciate the feedback we're getting on our fixed schedule that we had planned for our classes at our facility. We'd had to postpone and cancel a couple of those that were happening early in April. We're going to try to do some of those this month in May. So a raised bed construction, kind of a little workshop where we'll show you and help you learn how to build a raised bed. We are planning to do that this month in May. That's actually going to be a week from, that's going to be coming up. Yeah, it's going to be coming up in a week or so. We've got a container, how to construct and put together beautiful container plantings, just in time for Mother's Day, I suppose, if you'd like to do that. There's going to be a local scape university online. We're going to do a bunch of different things, even an irrigation workshop where we're going to try to manage a workshop through this kind of format. So please keep watching our website and register for those classes. You'll get the link to the webinars and then you'll be able to join. We encourage anybody to join and take part in these, and hopefully they're educational, they're helpful for you as you manage your landscapes, you manage your irrigation. And of course, the goal in all this is to have very attractive landscapes while you're reducing excess and unneeded irrigation. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll jump right into perennials. So as we go, there's a lot here. I want to preface that I've got a slide and some pictures for different perennials with some information about that perennial. There's the zone requirements, there's water requirements. If they're deer resistant, kind of time of year and type of flowers and what you can expect. Now, because there's so much and the time it would take to go through all of those in great depth, I'm not going to do that. I'll skim through and I'll talk about some of them and kind of hit the highlights, and I'll skim through them fast. But we are recording this webinar, and so feel free at any time to go back and watch this. The link for this will be on our website, and of course you'll be able to access it, review it, watch it again, and we'll also post just the slides. So if you don't want to watch the whole video, you could just open up the slides, quickly peruse through the slides to the slide you may have missed or need more information on, and you can look at that information on those slides. So don't worry about gathering all the information, trying to write it down, any of that kind of stuff. These slides and the presentation will be made available. It'll take us a day to get it on our website, but it'll be made available so you can review that and continue to learn. So with that, let's just jump right in and talk about perennials. You know, this is, I wanted just to start out with a little perennial bed. Now this is kind of a typical, this looks like it's midsummer. You got black-eyed Susans and cone flowers, and you've got a nice mix of stuff. But the idea with perennial beds is that you can plan and have various plants in there to provide color and texture and interest all year long. Now, it may not be from the same plant, but you will have interest in color all year as you use perennials, as opposed to if you've got annuals or different, some of those things, they're very costly. And then, yeah, you'll have color all year, but very labor intensive, very water intensive, and costly because you're replacing them every single year. So let's talk about these, the definitions and the terms. A perennial, this is important so that you don't get confused on what's what. Perennial is a plant that has a life cycle lasting more than 2 years. Now, there are short-lived perennials and there are long-lived perennials. There are, you know, so if you have a perennial plant and it's grown 2 or 3 years and then all of a sudden it disappears, that may be normal for that plant, where it only has a life cycle of 3 or 4 years and it's done, and then it needs to be replaced, or it goes to seed and then the new seeds come up and you perpetuate your perennial that way. An annual has a life cycle lasting only 1 growing season. So typically, if you grow it from seed, it pops up, it flowers, it lives, it grows just crazy. And at frost, it'll kill it and it'll die. And one of the big definitions between perennial and annual is simply where we live. An annual in our climate may be a perennial somewhere else because it doesn't have the harsh extremes of the cold, you know, some of the things. So, but an annual in our climate only lasts 1 growing season. A biennial is a plant that completes its life cycle. It completes its life cycle in 2 years. So it grows vegetatively and leafing, kind of a floret usually, sometimes not. It grows in 1 life cycle and then it'll seed or flower the next and produce fruit. So carrot is a good example of a biennial. A carrot grows, it actually grows a root. We eat the roots, but if you just left the plant out there, it'll grow 1 year. If you leave it in the ground, then the very next year, it'll send up a seed stalk on that same carrot and it'll produce seeds the 2nd year. So knowing those terms is going to be helpful for you as you kind of think about what are perennials, what are annuals, what's going to grow and what's going to not grow. One thing I wanted to touch on also is if you're looking at perennials in a nursery, you want to pay attention to the plant tags. Those plant tags have a wealth of information on them. They're going to have the name, they're going to have the description, they're going to have the plant size at maturity. That's an important thing. If you see this cute little thing that's flowering in the nursery in this little pot, don't just assume it's going to be this cute little thing in the pot. Look at the mature sizing and then plan and space things according to that mature sizing. You don't need to pack everything full and then have to take out half of your plants because they're overcrowded. You also want to pay attention to hardiness zone, just like I mentioned with annuals and perennials. You might think you're buying a perennial plant, but if it's a hardiness zone 7, and you're in a 5, that plant will not overwinter and it's going to become an annual for you. It'll be done in 1 season, you'll replace it. Pay attention to the sun requirements, shade, full sun, part sun, and then it has water requirements and care instructions. If it should cut back every year, if it should be left, if it develops a little bit more of a woody structure to it, and so forth. So for the most part, those plant tags are going to be accurate. Now, there are microclimate conditions and there are other factors that sometimes change the growth of a perennial a little bit. It'll do a little better or a little worse than what it says on the tag. But generally speaking, the tags are there to guide you on what you're doing. So I threw in this slide here about grouping perennials. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to put perennials together in groups that the grouping has the same characteristics. So if you're into native plants, put native plants together. They're going to have a similar sun need. They're going to have a similar water need. You're not going to be trying to fight the conditions of one plant because you need to meet the needs of another. If you're into shade gardening, well, don't look for full sun perennials to put in the shade. Group similar plants with similar needs together. This also has a term generally when you talk about irrigation in these situations, is you're hydrozoning. You're putting things together that have a similar water need. Well, you're also considering sun needs and fertilization needs and all the basic needs. That's why the plant tags come as a great guide. So you'll kind of know oh, this matches these other types of plants that I have in my garden, and it needs full sun. I'll group it with the full sun plants on the south side of my house. They get lots of sun, so forth. All the bits of information for grouping are on the plant tags. So generally speaking, we talk about perennials in this setting because most perennials fit into lower water or water efficient landscapes, simply because of their physiology and how they grow. They're more adapted to be able to use less, to tolerate a little bit of drought stress. Now, not all of them. There are certain conditions for some, but perennials generally fit into our water efficient landscapes, and they're very attractive. They're great for many, many reasons, and we'll talk about all those as we get into the individual plants. Really quick, I'm going to touch on the 7 principles that the perennials fit into this. One is you're planning and you're thinking about design. When you're thinking of perennials, you're thinking about when they bloom, how tall they are, the colors, and so you can figure out and design specific looks and feels based on the time of year and so forth, and what plants you choose. If you know what your soil type is, you'll be better off on which plants will thrive and do better in that soil type. Of course, the proper plant selection. This is the right plant, the right place. This is not putting full sun plants in the shade and vice versa, so that you're fighting the environment to try to get your plants to succeed. Efficient irrigation is key. You're learning how these plants best use the water and how often they need to be watered to be healthy. One of our principles is creating practical turf. And if any of you have followed our local scape principles, it's planning turf. Put turf where it's needed and plan for it. Don't use it as a default cover for everywhere in the landscape. And of course, use some mulches to help with weed control, to help with soil moisture retention, hardscapes, which include paths, patios. And then of course, it's getting out in your yard and enjoying it while you maintain it. Maintenance doesn't have to be a chore. If you're kept up on it, it can just be that part of enjoying the landscape. You're in it, you're weeding for 15 minutes at a time, and you're just going through and you're really keeping up on it while you're enjoying the beauty of your landscape. So these principles are kind of the same. They're just the principles that work. You need to know your site. You need to know what's going to fit. So we're going to skip over that. Now I'm going to jump into the different sections of plants. I'm going to start with bulbs. Technically, they're not what we think of as an herbaceous perennial. They're a bulb, but because they come back year after year, I've grouped them into bulbs here just for the sake of talking about how this is one little category of plants that can give you really great spring color, while the other perennials are just getting started and coming out of dormancy, and getting into the May and Junes and so forth. But your bulbs can provide you an excellent color in the early part of the spring when nothing else is actually up. So, of course, tulip species, there are hundreds of varieties of tulips. Colors, heights, bloom times. There's the late spring, early spring. Tulips of any color are available. So you can use tulips to design. If you really like certain colors or you need to accent certain colors, there is a tulip available for that. And there's so many neat different ones now. The fringe, the peony type tulips. There's just so many great things there. The daffodils fit into the narcissus family. They are also great, and there's so many new varieties of these in a range of colors, including the pinks. Pinks to whites to yellows is the primary, but the different cup shapes and so forth. Just a fantastic, nice color scheme. They're deer resistant. Deer usually don't mess with them. Deer do love the tulips, so if you're in a deer-prone area, tulips aren't going to work for you. But deer really don't mess with daffodils. The great color, pretty good lasting, and again, a range of size and colors and so forth with those. Crocus are a really early blooming, very small bulb. These, you can use them as naturalizing, kind of little accents. These are kind of, to me, the first little things that bloom, and they're the sign that spring is just right around the corner. It's very common to have crocus bloom, and then you still get those spring snowstorms that come rolling through. Very, very common for that. Some people, as in this picture, they've used them to naturalize within lawn because the lawn isn't really active yet. The crocus come in and bloom really nicely, and then they fade. The leaves of the crocus actually just kind of look like lawn, and they can just be mowed, and then they just disappear. The bulb's still in the ground. That would take a lot of bulbs to do that, but it would be pretty cool if you could do it and make it work. Ornamental onion, another bulb. These are showy in the sense that they get tall, the big globe purple flowers, but there's some shorter alliums that have the yellows and the pinks and the different colors on them. Just another great accent in the spring to be used. And a few types that aren't, well, hyacinth is a bulb and snowdrops are a bulb, but the windflowers, they're a corm. Mini iris aren't a true bulb, but these are really early spring colors to be added to landscape, again, as the filler. So your landscape's not just barren in the later part of March into April, while everything else is just coming out of dormancy. Quite a range of color, quite a range of size, and lots of different things that can bring that interest to a landscape while it's just coming out of that winter dormancy. So now, with that, I'm gonna go through these. I tried to think of the best way to organize these, and there's so many ways, of course, just like the principles I talked about at the beginning of the ways you could organize. I just decided I would organize them by spring bloomers, summer, and then fall. Now, within spring, we're going to talk about some shade plants. We're going to talk about full sun plants. There may be a few native plants in here. Again, it's just the bloom time. So you're going to have to figure out what may work for you in your yard and based on soil conditions. And I also want to throw out there that this is not by any means the comprehensive list of what perennials are available. There are new plants coming out. Plant hybridizers and growers are coming out with new stuff every single year. Fantastic choices. I would also say we have some great nurseries locally, and we have a perennial grower locally in Layton, Perennial Favorites Nursery. They're a wholesale nursery that sells to all of our local nurseries here. So if you pick up a thing that says Perennial Favorites, it was grown locally here. They've got great selection and do a fantastic job with their perennials and introducing new things all the time. That was just one. I'm not necessarily advocating you buy just theirs, but there are a lot of good perennials on the market. Willard Bay Gardens is a little niche garden. They do a great job. Historically, they've had some harder to find type stuff that they've grown and brought in, some natives and really low water stuff, very unique perennials. It's kind of a little niche garden or nursery in Willard. Also a great place to look for some, but you can buy perennials anywhere, box stores and so forth. But let me just go on with these then, with the spring bloomers. Now, rock daphne, I will say something about the daphnes. They're beautiful. We tried to find some recently, and they're a little harder to find. I think they're one of those plants that, for whatever reason, they're maybe a little bit harder to grow starting out, getting them going. And so nurseries maybe are not growing those quite as much, so they're just not as available. But if you can find daphnes, there's several varieties of daphne. They're beautiful plants. They do well, and they're just just an all-around attractive plant. They can grow a range of size. This one particularly 12 inches tall, 3 feet wide. So they're kind of shorter but wider. These can be used in rock gardens. You cut it back just like any other perennial, keep it compact. Does best in well-drained soil, zone 5 to 9 type plant. Now I'm just gonna keep cruising through these now because I've got, I don't know, 70 or 80 of these plants to get through, but we'll just keep going through. Pasque flower. This one is a really unique, very early bloomer. You usually see pasque flower blooming with the daffodils. Now there's a white one and a purple one. So this is a true perennial. It's not a bulb or anything else, but it blooms so early. Now the picture here I showed you is the flower, but then the seed, the little seed head that it shows is the picture on the bottom. Its seed head is just as interesting, maybe not as colorful, but just as interesting as the flower itself. So a lot of people grow it for both, because that little seed head, and they're not seeders. They don't self-seed and grow crazy on you unless the site is just perfect conditions for that. I've never really seen this taking off from seed, but they're just an interesting looking plant, and both the flower and the seed head form. So great option for a very early bloom in purple. And it gets about 12 inches tall, 12 inches wide. Very nice little mounding perennial. Basket of gold. And now I've got the common name and botanical name on here if you want to look them up later. The basket of gold is a very early spring flower, it's spring to early summer. You see the picture there, beautiful gold, yellow, This one is an interesting one to me. I've thrown it in here because it's a great water-wise plant. The foliage is a little bit kind of a grayish green. Once the flowers are gone, the foliage is still interesting. It's kind of a good rock garden plant. It's not the most formal or not the most showy when it's not flowering, but when it's flowering, it is a blanket of yellow or gold. So it's a good border plant. You'd want to put other plant material with this so that as this one fades, something else is taking the show later. And because like I said, the foliage isn't, to me, it's not fantastic. It's a great plant, but other stuff could take the show, and this could just kind of go into the background when it's done blooming. Red hot poker. These come in yellows to reds. I've seen some deep red. These are spike, the foliage on these looks just kind of like a spiky grass, but then it shoots up the tall flower stalks, 3 to 4 feet tall. Later spring bloomers, very drought and heat tolerant, and they don't need much water at all. You'd cut down those flower stalks when they're done, and then the plant itself can kind of serve as a different texture because of that grass-like look to it, the narrow leaf and so forth. So it serves the color in the spring and then more of a textural function through the summer and into fall. And then it's just cut back once a year to the ground in the fall when it's done. The vegetative part of that's done. I have seen on occasion, there's a variety out there that will bloom in the fall for these. We've only seen that a couple times, but there is one out there that will bloom in the fall. Matte daisy. Notice it has a typical daisy flower. This is a very low matte ferny green leaf right to the ground. So this is just going to be a few inches tall. Great for a sunny kind of rock garden border plant. It doesn't have to be a rock garden. It can tolerate some irrigation, but it doesn't need a lot of irrigation, watering once every 2 weeks kind of scenario, depending on the soil, depending on the site. It could tolerate water once a week. Blooms in late spring, but it's a nice looking, low growing, ferny looking ground cover that gives you those nice daisy looking little flowers. The daisy flower is not going to be big like your typical Shasta daisy. It's a little bit smaller, but it's a very similar look and a great all around plant, zone 4. Amsamia, this is also referred to as blue star. So this one is one, I don't have a lot of personal experience with this one, but it is a brighter green, compact, slow spreading plant, full sun to part sun. So this is kind of one of those, it'll tolerate the full sun. You probably wouldn't want to put this one in your hottest spot, but it'll tolerate the full sun or it tolerates a little shade. It'll get about 1 foot tall, but it can spread slowly. It's not an aggressive spreader, but it can get several feet wide as it spreads. Turns a nice yellow in the fall. Does well in dry open areas. It tolerates some moderate water. Does well in dry, but it tolerates the moderate watering. Deer resistant as well on this one. So I'll just continue on. This one's a kind of a common one. You see this blooming now as you drive around, you may see some yards with some colors, some pinks and blues and stuff like this. Rock cress is a great plant. Early spring bloomer, 12 inches tall or so. Some of them are a little shorter, 8 to 12. Spreading, it can droop, it can kind of trail over walls a little bit. It has a similar look to creeping phlox, but the foliage is very different. But from a distance, you might think this is phlox, or you might think, as we get to phlox, it could be rock cress. So, those two look very similar from a distance. The foliage is quite different on them. But there are some color choices in this. It's full sun to part shade. Great plant, again, for walls, for rock gardens, border plants. It can fill in, and right now, as I mentioned, if you drive around and you see some of these, just a nice little mound of color. Really good, hardy plants, good on the water. You'd group that with things that are kind of in that moderate, they're getting regular water, like a once a week type watering scenario or something, would be completely adequate with these. Another kind of lower growing, kind of a mat former is the sandwort. Now this is another one I don't have a lot of personal experience with, and I've borrowed a couple of photos off the internet for these. But this has a narrow glossy green leaf that forms that mat like it shows in this picture. blooms in the mid-spring, is great drought tolerant, deer resistant, can tolerate full sun or part shade. So it's kind of one of those great plants that fits in an area that it gets a little bit of heat and sun, but it can also be a little bit shaded and do very well. But it'll expect this kind of blooming kind of in that mid-spring range. And then once those blooms fade, the foliage is interesting enough that it's a narrow, glossy looking leaf that it's just a nice little border plant. Sunrose, also called helianthemum. These are great. These almost become shrubby. They're a shrubby perennial. You wouldn't necessarily cut these down like you would some other perennials because they kind of form a woody tissue to them. And they're evergreen. The foliage kind of stays green through the winter, and they'll bloom in late spring. But the color options of these are incredible because you have one that pictured here is the pink, but there's orange, which is also a little bit unique to find, is true orange. You got oranges and yellows and pinks, quite an array of colors, deeper pinks, quite a range of coloring options on these, 12 inches tall to 24 inches wide. Nice, kind of taller ground covered border plants, just an all around good. I really like these. They look neat. They're great for low water, and they're just kind of a tougher perennial plant that does great. Moderate type watering on these is adequate. They tolerate some dry. You get them average water, they're going to do great. So here's another picture of sunrose. So this goes with this slide here, just to show some of the color range and then what the plant looks like when it doesn't have flowers on it. So not a super showy plant without flowers. Again, that's why you're planning and incorporating different plants together so that as one does its show and then finishes off, the next comes on and does its show. And perennials, for the most part, some of them give perpetual flowering. They'll bloom all summer long, and you're deadheading and you're helping them to grow, stimulate growth for new flowering. But most of them have a window. They have their 5-week, 6-week, 3-week window, whatever that is for them. And that's when they do their show, and they want to set seed and they want to be done. That's why you're incorporating different things so that you get that change in the landscape. You got the focal points that change and the interest changes. So here's one for shade, a spring bloomer. It's a woodland perennial. If you do some searching on this one, you might find some comments or different things that say, oh no, this is an aggressive weed. In certain parts of the country where the climatic environments are just right, this thing will spread. It'll self-seed, and it can be a spreader. It can just really go on its own. Here in our climate, it's not going to do that. It's actually, we've had some in the learning garden, and it's almost been a little bit of a struggle to get it to really kind of start going and taking off. It's grown, it's done okay. It definitely needs a part shade to full shade environment. It does not tolerate your hot sunny spot. It won't do well there at all. It needs some medium water use, fairly regular water use. It's going to bloom. This one will bloom for a very long time though. Bloom May to September, 18 to 12 inches tall and wide. Good drainage. If it has wet soil, it will kill in the winter. It'll rot. And that's a condition for quite a few perennials, is they need enough drainage to where they're not sitting in just a cold, frozen soil. Well, I shouldn't say cold and frozen. It's cold and frozen are the same. They are really wet and very cold soils will kill this plant over winter. So now here's one. I'm showing this one for specific to foliage. Not every perennial plant that you're going to grow is going to have the interest of color. But that's the joy of perennials, is sometimes your interest isn't in the flower at all. It's in the year-long coloring and the interesting texture of the foliage. And this is one of those, the sage wormwood or mugwort. It's a terrible name for this thing. A lot of times it's actually known by its botanical name, Artemisia. And it's just a fern leaf sage, and it's a great looking plant, silver foliage all season, no significant blooms, very drought tolerant, deer resistant, loves the full sun. If this gets too much water, it can tend to kind of flop open a little bit. Instead of being nice and tight and rounded, it'll flop. which becomes a little unsightly, but it can be cut back, regrow into nice tight. So, a little leaner on the water keeps it a little more tight, a little more uniform in shape, but a great textural plant in the garden for that color. This is not sagebrush sage. This is not going to be your giant sagebrush that's out in the wild. This is a different sage, very nice texture, soft texture, that's great for landscapes. Moving on to coral bells, also known as heuchera. You can see from the pictures, there are so many colors of these, you can't possibly put all the pictures on one slide. These are grown for foliage. Notice the one picture does have some flower stalks on it. The flower stalks are really not that significant. They're there and they have a little color to them, but this is not grown for flowering. It's grown for the foliage and the range of foliage that exists with this particular type of plant. And these are best in full shade to part shade. Great shade plants, but you're going to get this whole range from silvers to deep purples. And you can see in that picture in the middle, there's kind of the reds and oranges and dark greens, everything in between. So if you have a shade garden and you're trying to figure out a color that fits in there, sometimes in shade, you don't get the flowering you would in a full sun area, but you can get really good color by using coral bells in those shaded sites because of the leaves. And they're like that all year. So you don't have to worry about the bloom times and any of that. So great plant for shade, giving you lots of color options. Candy tuft, these may not be the best pictures of candy tuft. It is again, this is kind of a half shrubby little dwarf, semi-evergreen spreading, not a rapid spreader, but a slow spreader as it grows, the mound. It's great, blooms April to May, really nice white blooms on a very dark green foliage. Some of you have grown these. I like these. I think they're really attractive. They tend to have a nice habit, nice shape to them. They can be grown in nice little clumps and mound and grouped with other things to accent them. Very nice border plant, rock garden plant. Kind of a moderate water range on these. I group them with other things that are getting water about once a week. Columbine, shade. This is a shade type. It'll tolerate a little sun, but columbines, you see these out in the wild. There's some native columbines up in the mountains. You hike around, if y'all go to Albion Basin or something, there's columbines. There's all kinds of native perennials and stuff, but this is a great spring bloomer. Again, a large range of color to add into a shaded area. They can get 18 inches tall or so, 12 to 18. Not the foliage usually is lower than that, but then the flower stalks shoot up. But these have great foliage. They have got great flowers, lots of color options, pretty much any color you want in these as well. They do prefer a little bit more water. If soils are moist, they'll thrive and do a little bit better, but they will tolerate a little bit of dry and a little bit of full sun conditions. But I would not put these in your hottest areas of your yard. You won't succeed with them. They will look pretty ragged and beat in August, but they'll live. They just won't look their best. So moving on to daylily, we're still in spring. So moving on to daylily. Some people love daylilies, some people hate them. I think that the reason some people dislike these is I think they're just so commonly used, and much of the commonality of these is they're just yellow. You see a lot of yellow or a lot of orange daylilies planted. And there's quite a range though of colors. There's lots of options. And daylilies are great. They're tough plants, 18 to 24 inches tall. They have that nice grass-like foliage. I shouldn't say grass-like. They're not grass-like in the sense that they just have long, narrow foliage, long, narrow leaves. They add some interesting texture and they add great color, and they're very tough. These are a great tough perennial, easy to divide, easy to share. So there's nothing really wrong with them other than they're very common, maybe a little overused, and so they kind of lose some of their excitement. Pinks or dianthus. These, again, a range of color, range of options, both, the foliage the foliage itself is quite similar on all of these. They can range in colors, kind of the gray to the deeper greens, but then on the blooms, notice you got roughly blooms, just kind of flat, single type petal blooms, but the range of color is quite wide. You got a lot of color options. These are late spring bloomers into early summer, 8 to 12 inches tall, 10 to 20 inches wide. So again, it's a kind of a shorter but wider perennial as it grows and matures. Low to moderate water on these, full sun to part shade. Deer don't eat them. So I think these are a great option to provide that type of a size and shape with lots of different color options to meet individual needs. So moving on some more, spotted dead nettle. Now that sounds like a weed, if you know, the dead nettles and the stinging nettles, but this is not at all a weed. It's in the family of Lamium. This is a great fast growing ground cover. It's kind of taller, not taller, it's 4 to 6 inches tall, spreads very nicely, but not aggressively to fill in areas. Best used in partial shade to full shade, but there's a range of color of these. Now, this one here kind of shows a variegated, a little bit lighter leaf with a dark edge. There's some really dark ones, there's some really light ones. So there's kind of a range of color of foliage on these, and then they send up the flower stalks on these. Look very nice. They do prefer moist but well-drained soils, but a great, I should say, shade garden ground cover. These look really nice. They will tolerate a little bit of sun, but not your hot areas. But if you put it in a full sun, well, I shouldn't say full sun, a sunny place on the east side of your house where it got afternoon shade from that real intense hot sun, they'd probably do okay. All right, firecracker penstemon. This is actually a native Utah penstemon. Funny enough, Utah is the center of diversity for native penstemons. There's 100 plus varieties of penstemon out there that range all along the Wasatch Range that goes all into Canada all the way to Mexico, the Rocky Mountain Range, excuse me, and then Wasatch Range in there. But Utah is kind of the center of diversity, and we have a lot of native penstemons that just love our climate. This one does really well in a landscape if it's treated properly. Early spring bloom with that really nice, it's basically like fire engine red. 1 to 3 feet tall. It has a stalk, the flower stalk that comes up and the little flowers on the stalk. And then when that's done, you can cut off the flower stalks and the foliage is still nice. It's got great foliage. A nice green, you know, they're all green, but this is just a nice green color of foliage through the summer. It only typically blooms once. You might have a couple sporadic stalks come up, a second bloom, but they're not nearly as showy if it's deadheaded. Deadheaded means you take off the spent flowers. But this is a great native plant. This one, once it's established, doesn't need any additional water. And it will do poorly in really organic type soils where it holds moisture around the crown of the plant. They will rot over winter. So if it's, notice these are in a gravelly area, that's because that organic material that holds water is not beneficial for these through the winter. They can really struggle and die off in the winter. But if treated properly, these are fairly long-lived. They can live several years, just flower great for you. You can let the seed stalks mature and harvest the seeds and grow new ones from seed as well. But that's a great native plant. Rocky Mountain penstemon is also a native plant, a little more traditional in the type of perennials. It'll tolerate more conditions, but a great blue, 2 to 3 feet tall, spring bloomer in May, loves the full sun. You deadhead it. It usually does have a second round of blooms, not nearly as nice as the first, but kind of a once a week, once every 10-day type watering schedule for this one. But a great looking perennial plant, nice flower stalks, and it's kind of tall, 2 to 3 feet tall on those when they're matured and healthy. Gooseberry globe mallow is another native plant. Now, funny enough, these are all by accident got my native plants all kind of grouped together here. You'll see a variety of these sometimes out along highways, just a nice little orange flower, the gray-green foliage. That's not a look that everybody loves, but this is a true orange native perennial that's just, the coloring on it is just great. They're easy to grow. It blooms late spring into early summer, full sun. One of the few native oranges like I talked about. No water after establishment is needed. No real maintenance. You just cut it down once a year. Super easy plants to grow. Not aggressive, at least in my experience. They're not aggressive. They're not weed-like. But a nice native plant with no water. If you had an area of your yard that's tough to deal with, the first year on all these natives that I'm talking about, give them some supplemental water the first year. Once they're established, you wouldn't need to irrigate them again. Natural precipitation would take care of them. They do bloom in the spring, and then they're not going to look super great by the end of summer, but they're still alive and they'll come back and they'll do their thing again. Palmer's penstemon's another one. These are a tall one, 4 to 5 feet tall, depending. I should probably put a range of 3 to 5 feet. If they're in a fairly nutrient-rich soil where they'll grow tall. This clump in this picture happens to be multiple plants. There's 3 or 4 plants in here grouped together. One plant by itself will be about 12 to 18 inches in diameter. Send up, a dozen, 15 or so, I don't know, maybe a few more than that, flower stalks. They are very fragrant. The bees love them. The fragrance on them is really nice. We had a bunch of these come up. We kind of seeded some of these and let them grow naturally on top of the water tank that's at our facility in our garden a couple years ago. They were beautiful, and the fragrance on it was amazing. They do prefer sandy, well-drained soil. You can cut you should cut the spent flowers down again, just like all these others. Once they're done, the flowers done, you cut the stalks off. The foliage is a nice gray or green looking foliage. Really nice plant. This is a nice one of my favorites. Pikes Peak purple penstemon, not a native penstemon, but there's lots of penstemons. This one, really nice deep purple, semi-evergreen foliage. Needs cut back when it's done flowering. It's pictured here with moonshine yarrow. Yarrow is not a favorite of mine, but it does have some good color. So if it's matched up with some other perennials, you get some really nice color, but it's not really a focal plant. Gives some nice background color and so forth. There's also an elfin pink penstemon that I'm not showing in any other slides that looks just like this, but pink. Same type of thing. It's not a native, it's a cultivated variety, but a great plant. Does super well in our soils and our climate. Kind of a moderate water on this one. All right, so that's just a few of the spring bloomers. Now, as I said, there's a whole lot more out there. We could go on and on. We could have a class just on spring blooming perennials that lasts a couple hours if we really got comprehensive. These are just some that I know we've grown most of those in our learning garden. I've grown some of those in myself and my own yard or yards over the years. And so now we're moving to summer and go through the summer perennials that are great, that are going to do well for you. English lavender is an herb, but it can be, some people just grow it simply as a perennial. It's a great looking plant. It prefers full sun, blooms in late spring into summer, more seen it kind of in midsummer. A lot of people use this as an herb, but like I said, some people use this just for the color and they like the fragrance when they brush up against it. This is the lavender that make, lavender oil. There's lavender farms. They extract the oils from those leaves and you use them for all kinds of stuff. But it's a great plant. It's tough. It tolerates our soils, 1 to 2 feet tall, 1 to 2 feet wide. You deadhead the flowers on this to keep it looking its best. And then depending on, there's a few varieties of lavender out there. We usually like to wait till spring to cut this one down. They seem to do better for us when we do that than trying to cut it down in the fall and dispose of the top dead. Wait till spring. It does form a kind of a woody trunk material down in the center of that. And then that may have something to do with cutting it when you cut it, and frost and different things on it. Moisture through the winter. So we like to leave ours just up through the winter, and then we clean them up and trim them back in the spring. But a great plant. Husker red penstemon cultivation. This is a penstemon cultivar. It is 3 to 4 feet tall. Actually, I've never seen one 4 feet tall. 2 to 3. I should change that to 2 to 3 feet tall. This is really grown again for foliage. It does have a nice flower on it. It blooms midsummer. It has a very nice pink, light pink to white tint flower, but the foliage on it, it's that combination of the green to burgundy, which is a very unique combination in the same plant. The green foliage and burgundy foliage on the same thing, and then you accent that with a white to very light pink flower. Beautiful flower, beautiful plant. It needs to be deadheaded to keep it attractive. But that's a really nice one if you're looking for that kind of a darker, deeper foliage. One that I would recommend. Fairly moderate kind of average moderate watering, not a super drought tolerant, but not a heavy water need, just an average moderate water user. Shasta daisies. A lot of you are very familiar with these. Shasta daisy's been around a very long time. There's a lot of new cultivations of Shasta daisy. You can get quite a range of size, of height. There are some Shasta daisies that can self-seed and be maybe a little bit aggressive. I would read the tags and be careful, but there are some great varieties of these. These can be 3 feet tall. There are some compact varieties, again, that stay short to about 12 inches. And these are pretty tough. I put once a week watering on these because they kind of fit with a lot of the other moderate water type plants. They can go a little bit longer, but to keep them really looking good, to keep them going well, once a week is good. If you water too much on these can also tend to get droopy. They can get a little top heavy and kind of split open where the whole plant doesn't look great because it's all laying on the ground. So don't overwater, but give them plenty to keep them looking good. You deadhead the spent flowers. Again, you just remove them, you cut them off. It doesn't have to be down inside. You just go a few inches down, you can cut off the spent flowers. A lot of times you'll get a little bit of rebloom. And then you just cut it back once a year. Bergarten sage, salvia family. This is a foliage plant used just, again, for the range of texture and color because they're kind of semi-evergreen. They prefer full sun, once a week watering, tolerate drought and heat really well. And I've put the picture of the flower. They do flower, and the flower is interesting and nice. But mostly these are grown for, I mean, it is an herb. It's sage. You can use this as a sage herb, but it's grown mostly for just the texture and interest of the leaves. Now I'm going to show you a couple more varieties of this. So there's kind of the real one. I shouldn't say the real one. The true Salvia Bergarten sage. And then you've got some varieties of that. You have the purple sage and then the golden variegated sage. And these are all very similar. They're the same plant, just cultivations of it where you get a different color. So as you look to grow these and are interested in these, you can get some different colors, some different interest. Again, the semi-evergreen foliage, the variegation of some of them. Anyway, great plant, nice looking plant. We're still in summer bloomers. So we've got May night sage. May night sage is quite common. These are the salvia sages. A lot of people have these, and there's some variation in color of the sages, but this is a full sun to part shade type plant, 18 to 24 inches tall and wide. It blooms in the midsummer. It continues to bloom when it's cut back. So if you deadhead this, once it's done, you can get 2 and sometimes 3, and depending on the year, you might even get a 4th bloom out of these. Now, each time it blooms successively through the season, it's usually not quite as full or quite the show as the first bloom in the early summer. But if you do that right, and once those seed heads are spent and dried up and they start going down, you're cutting them off. It'll send up new growth, new seed heads. Now, I should kind of talk about why that is really quick. When you're deadheading, plants aren't thinking, but they're instinctively there. The goal of this plant is to produce a mature seed. The mature seed is done through a flower. The flower is pollinated, the pollen's exchanged, so forth. You're maturing a seed. When you cut that off before the plant spends a lot of energy maturing the seed, it triggers the plant to say, oh no, I need to set seed. It sends up more blooms. And so you're tricking the plant into blooming more by deadheading it because it wants to set seed. Now, not all plants will do that prolifically. Some, it's just a once a year deal and they're done. Whereas others, you keep deadheading those back and you'll continue to stimulate the blooming on those. So here's a couple more of the salvias just to show a little bit of range of color. There's some pinks to darker pinks to light pinks. And then there's one that's Ostfriesland variety that has a really nice purple stem. So you get the purple flowers with the purple stem that creates a little bit more of an interest in a deeper color to it. But all of these are great. They're easy to divide, easy to take care of. I think the salvias are a great plant all around. I should mention with salvias though, the bees do love them. If you have any issues with bees or bee allergies, You may want to avoid this one because it is certainly a bee attractor. The bees love it. So if you're on the other side of that and you want to attract bees to your yard, this is one you need to have in your yard. You just need to plant some salvias. It'll draw the bees in. We already talked about red hot pokers. I don't know, I accidentally got that in the wrong section. So plumbago is a dark green mounding, spreading border plant or tall ground cover. Some of you are familiar with this plant. It tolerates full sun, it tolerates part shade, kind of medium water to low water. It's one of those plants that almost grows in any condition, and it'll flower and be generally happy. Now, if the soils are terrible, you may struggle. If fertility is a problem, you know, in the soils, there may be some issues. But this is kind of one of those plants that isn't too picky. It grows in a lot of conditions, 12 inches tall, good for anything in our climate here along the Wasatch Front at least. Just an all-around okay plant. It's not overly impressive, but as far as a darker green, the foliage will turn kind of a burgundy, bronzy color in the fall. You know, it's nice. Not, like I said, it's not a real showstopper by any means, but it's a great plant all around for if you want a ground cover. It will spread. If you're looking for a spreading type ground cover, not super aggressively spreading, not like vinca or some of those, but it is a ground cover that will spread. Red valerian Jupiter's beard. Now, I cautiously put this one in there because I think it's a great perennial. It's attractive. It does have a couple downsides in my opinion, which I'll talk about. It is a full sun perennial to part shade. It'll get 2 to 3 feet tall. There's a white variety and this kind of pink, dark, deep pink to whatever color that is. I think it's deep pink. Anyway, tolerates low water, but not in extended dry or hot spells. It'll kind of suffer then. But my one experience with this is it can self-seed, and if the conditions are just right, to me, this one almost becomes a little bit weed-like. So I throw this in here because it is a great perennial. Very tough, very tolerant of our conditions, but maybe a little too tolerant to make it in the borderline weed category. Some people have grown this and they never have issues, but if your site is good and the soils, everything is just right, you will have self-seeded little valerians everywhere, and you'll be cursing because of it. They're easy to weed out when they're small, but again, if you don't want to face that battle, cross this one off your list. Whirling butterflies, great informal wispy perennial, 18 inches to 30 inches tall. The foliage isn't much to speak about here. Not super showy, kind of informal, a little bit maybe ragged looking, not ragged, just informal. Blooms in the spring. It actually blooms a long extended bloom time. Once it starts blooming, it'll just bloom into the fall, into frost. It's deer resistant. There's a range, kind of the white to light pink to darker pink in color, depending on the specific cultivated variety of it. Some of them are a little taller, some are a little shorter. And they often refer to some of these as whirling butterflies, or because the flower almost looks like a little butterfly hovering above the foliage as the wind moves them and stuff. Quite attractive, very tough, low water type perennial. Gallery lupin. You see quite a lot of these, and these, if you go hiking up at high elevation in the winters or stuff, you'll see lupins, some of the native lupins and stuff up there in the blues. This is a great full sun to part shade plant. I think it prefers a little bit of the cooler areas of your yard. If you had a north, or like you said, the north and east areas where they've got a little bit of shade, but it gets a bit of sun. The range of these, you can get blues to pinks to reds, yellows, white blossoms, quite a nice tall, 1 to 3 feet, nice flower stock. The foliage is great. The flowers are great. This is not a drought tolerant perennial, but for a shaded area, a cooler area of your yard, they're beautiful. They provide some nice interest of the foliage as well as the bloom. So I've thrown them in here on this list because they can work great with kind of that good moderate water category in a cooler location of the yard. Coral Canyon Twin Spur. This is a summer bloomer. As I mentioned, we're still in summer. 12 inches tall, pink to purplish bloom. Kind of a coral, I should have said. It's called Coral Canyon because the bloom color is actually more of a coral color instead of pink. I mean, it's all kind of the same. Blooms longer with a little extra water, once a week watering. And this will continue to bloom all summer long. We put it in the summer category because once it starts, that's its main flush of flowering. But it'll continue to bloom without deadheading. This is a little flower stalk, but there's so many of them, you don't really deadhead this one. It just keeps blooming through the season, and then you kind of cut it back in the fall or the spring. This one's a nice one. I like this one. It can spread a little from the clump. It just widens, and so it can send up little shoots here on the outside of the main plant. So it'll expect it to spread a little bit that way, but not aggressive or weed-like. Rondo mixed penstemon. These I really like because it's a mix. So if you buy one of these and you see it flowering, you know what color it is. But if you don't see it flowering when you buy it, you may not know if it's pink to that lighter purple to bluish to deep dark purple. Beautiful stalks, very full flowering. I've grown these in my own yards and I love them. Again, they attract bees, but I like the range of the colors on these. So you have a few of them and they could be different colors, different hues of the colors. Full sun to part shade works for these. I've grown them in full sun and they do great. Evergreen foliage, they do need to be deadheaded, but the foliage stays green. It's more like a base floret, and then you can just cut the flower stalks off. Over time, they actually develop kind of a woodier tissue to them as well. But these will self-seed a little bit, not aggressively, and I've liked to self-seed them because then I have more of them, and they don't seem to last forever. Within a few years, it seems like the parent plants may just get old and fade and die off, and then you've got your new ones that seeded, and they sometimes cross-pollinate, and you get a little bit different color out of them. The self-seeded ones, and I just dig up those little seedlings when they show up because they're not too many, and I move them around to where I want them in my yard. But I like this one. This is a good one. Cranesbill geranium. So here's one, summer bloomer, but this is more for shade, part shade. Will work in the sun, but that's best in a little bit shaded area. Nice long bloom, time on it. Nice mounded habit. You can see the interesting texture of the foliage. Now this is not like your annual geraniums that you bring in the winter and you have to put them in a pot or hang them upside down or do any of that stuff. This is a nice hardy perennial. You leave it outside. It does best, just in kind of your cooler conditions with a moderate water. It'll tolerate some dry shade, but it's not one of those areas that you're just going to not water at all. This needs some supplemental water, but the varieties include blue and white, purple and pink flowers. So it's a good one to use, a good option. Chocolate flower. Now this gets its name for its fragrance. If you're a chocolate lover, you'd love the smell of it. And don't try this because I don't really know if these are toxic, but I tasted one once. Because the curiosity, you just like, this smells, if it tastes anything like it smells, we're going to be eating these. But of course it doesn't taste at all like that, but it's chocolate scented, 12 to 14 inch tall. This is an informal plant, so it's not a nice little mounding thing. It's a little bit informal, but the flowers are great on it. Interesting enough, once it starts flowering, it just keeps flowering. It does best in full sun. It'll tolerate a little light shade. This early morning, you may look at this plant. Actually, excuse me, let me go back. Later in the evening, the heat of the summer into evening, you may look at this plant and say, where did all my flowers go? The petals actually kind of curl, and on the backside of the petals, they're not really that showy. They kind of curl up, and so they almost disappear a bit. And then early in the morning, these are opened up and they smell a strong fragrance of chocolate. And then late as the day goes on, the heat goes on, they kind of curl a little bit, fold up, and then they're open, brilliant again in the next day. Very interesting, very low water, requires no water after establishment type perennial. I love these, but they can kind of spread a little. They move, they're not aggressive by any means, but they're not formal. Just so you know what that's, the flower on them is about, that two inch diameter type size. But I think these are a really cool plant, great to be used in your yard. Wild Thing Sage. So this is a salvia related to your blue Mainites and other, but it's a little different. This one is a zone 5 to 10, 24 to 30 and 6 inches tall. Really nice color on them. Drought tolerant once established. Not much more to say about it. There's several of the salvias that I'm not showing in here. If you can find them, make sure they're hardy to our zone. There's a few that are not hardy. They grow them in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, and they're beautiful plants, but you need to make sure whatever salvias you're buying are at least hardy to where you live. And right along the Wasatch Front regions here, they kind of change those. But if you get something that's at zone 5 as the low number, you're going to be fine. So I should have explained the zones. The zone numbers, the lower the number means the more cold hardy a plant will be. And the higher the number, the less cold hardy. So if you get a zone 9 plant, it is not going to do super well in our climate. It'll freeze over winter. Okay, so anyway, Red Rocks penstemon, another great penstemon, pink color. I've showed a lot of these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this one. We'll just kind of keep moving on, but that's a great perennial too. These are all very tough, beautiful looking plants, a little bit informal, I suppose, but let's move on to Coreopsis. Coreopsis is a great little mounding plant with blooms that midsummer to frost once it starts. Easy cleanup once a year. You're watering these only every once a week to every 2 weeks, depending on the soils, depending on your conditions. In our learning garden, there were times there we'd be watering these twice a week, and they're fine. They tolerate that. But if you can only get water to them once a week, they'll usually do quite fine. I'm going to show you some more Coreopsis, the tick seed. Now this is Zagreb, the specific cultivation of Zagreb. These others, tick seed Coreopsis, they're all related, slightly different cultivations, but you can see the color and the interest and the variation of these. Just a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting color, and easy cleanup, well maintained, a nice habit to them. So just an all around good perennial. Flying saucer Coreopsis. I don't know, nothing more to say about this, but just lots of good Coreopsis varieties that work great in your garden. Most of them are going to have no problems, no issues, and they're just going to be great to plant. Pine leaf penstemon. This one's a little bit low to the ground, shrubbier. There's a red and a yellow, low water, midsummer bloom. If you need a red in the midsummer, which is sometimes hard to find, this one will fit that niche. 12 to 15 inches tall, 18 inches wide. Once a year cleanup, very easy. Smaller, it's called pine leaf because the leaves, a very finer textured leaf to it. And not much more else to say about that one, but easy cleanup, cut it back once a year. Bridges penstemon is another red that's summer. Most of the penstemons bloom in the spring, but you have a few that extend into summer, very, very few that bloom into fall. But 2 to 3 feet tall and wide, really nice red. Hummingbirds love these. Any of the red ones, the hummingbirds just love them. Moderate water, once these are established, you don't need to water them anymore. This is another native one. We'll move on to blanket flower, Gaillardias, the blanket flowers. So these prefer full sun, 1 to 2 feet high, yellow to orange to red. There's a lot of cultivations of these now as well, where they're getting lots of very interesting things, color-wise, texture-wise. And these don't need to be deadheaded. They kind of just keep blooming. And even the seed head is not bad on these. You can deadhead them if you had time, but this is not an easy job to deadhead because you'll have blooms with spent flowers all kind of mixed together. So it's like a one at a time you're taking off spent flowers. So usually we don't spend the time to deadhead these. So it's just a little bit time consuming and you don't need to do it. But tough perennial, tolerant of less water, will tolerate more water, and just an all around pretty good perennial, depending on your site, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So red feathers, this is an interesting one. It's 12 to 14 inches tall and wide, red feathery spikes. You deadhead for rebloom. This one thrives in poor soil. So if you got a really tough spot, more gravelly soils, harder to grow anything, this one should tolerate those poor soil conditions. This one comes out of, I believe this one comes out of cultivation out of New Mexico, where it's a kind of a high desert, well-adapted plant, tolerates cold, and look at the beautiful stalks you get on it. A little bit informal, but it's really interesting and attractive. So that's one worth trying. Sea holly. Now this one looks a lot like a weed as well, your thistles and stuff. But this is a cultivated plant to get that really strong blue color. The sea hollies have that unique blue with that unique thistly type head on them. They're not weeds, they don't spread, they're not aggressive. 18 to 24 inches tall, tolerates really dry, hot sites, and soils high in salts. But very unique and interesting look to them. And it can fit well with other, you'd have to plan this in. If it's just, you got one of these growing out there, someone might mistake this for a weed, but the unique blue color does indicate that it's something a little bit different. But again, something worth trying, something interesting to put into your garden, especially if you're moving to more lower water, lower maintenance type gardening and beds where you have interest all season. This provides a little bit of unique interest, so it's worth trying. Rose mallow or hardy hibiscus. These you've seen, they have that really large, some say it's a dinner plate sized flower, 12 inches, 10-inch diameter flowers on them. 24 to 36 inches tall and wide. These are quite tall plants, and that's all 1 year growth. These are herbaceous and they grow that tall in 1 year, and they flower in the summer. And you have that range of color from pinks to whites to kind of the combination, the darker center, the darker eye of the flower. Great perennials that if you need that something with a big presence, very showy, almost tropical looking. I like these. I really like these. And some of the cultivation of the leaf patterns are they're tightly lobed, and they're different things. Very, very intricate looking leaf patterns and so forth. Really nice perennials. I like them. You can grow them quite well here. Purple coneflower, otherwise known as echinacea. This is an old-time perennial, and it used to just be purple. Your options were purple coneflower, and you had purple. Now you have purple coneflower, but it's echinacea, and now there's all kinds of colors. There's the ranges from yellows to pinks to oranges and white, and they're the same type. They're coneflower, but they've been cultivated, and you have lots of color options. These are deer resistant. They're a good hardy perennial, fairly tall, easy to divide. They slowly spread. If you let them go over an area over time, you would have a lot of these, or the clumps would just be bigger. But they're easy to divide, easy to control, and a good tough fall, summer bloomer into fall. For that kind of color and height and texture. And even the spent seed heads are not terrible, but deadheading is good on these if you have time. If you don't, you just don't worry about it, because by the time they're done blooming, it's usually time to put the garden to bed. Here's a couple more examples of coneflower. Again, this is lots of different options and color. Moving on to this is a little bit different one for foliage. Green Santolina. There's also a gray Santolina. And this is an evergreen perennial that becomes shrub-like, 24 to 36 inches wide and tall, prefers full sun. If it's kept properly, it will maintain that nice little globe-like shape, very tight, dense. Too much water causes it to flop open. So you have kind of an open center with a bushy, you have basically a donut where you can see right into the center of the branches of this plant. Over time, it will develop a woody tissue. It can be cut down to maintain a nice new herbaceous growth every year on this. It does get a little button-like flower on it, as you can see in the one picture here. And the flowers are not, it's not grown for the flowers. The flowers are not really full. It's a little bit sporadic covering, but they're interesting. When they're done, you deadhead those all off. You can, just take hedge trimmers or your little shears and just easily trim those off, and you just got a really nice foliage. The gray one looks just like this, only gray. If kept and trimmed properly, they maintain a very nice shape. If not, they kind of look a little informal and maybe a little messy. But these are nice. I like them. They are evergreen, and they add an interesting texture to the landscape. All right, let's transition into fall. So another salvia, Raspberry Delight salvia. This is a late summer to fall bloomer, 2 to 3 feet wide and tall, very nice dark green foliage. It only requires cutting back once a year. Goes very nice with other accent plants like black-eyed Susan, ornamental grasses. And in the fall, there's so much going on with the grasses are now going. This goes really well with a lot of the textures and colors of fall. Windflower, this is an anemone. You see a white one and a pink one here in the picture. Many varieties range in height and color. Most are white and pink. This is a late summer into fall bloomer. It looks like a shade type plant, but this will tolerate full sun. It does, I think, for best in the shade, but we have some of these in the learning garden that are in full sun and they seem to do just fine where they are. But a nice option for a part shade area, somewhere where you get maybe a more moderate water and you need that kind of a flower color in the fall. Blue Fortune hyssop. Now there's two pictures there, close-up of the flower and then the picture of a mature plant that's actually drooping a little. This is a big plant. I don't have the descriptions on here, but this will get 2 to 3 feet tall. It attracts butterflies, it attracts bees. The flower stalks, again, a little too much water causes it to be heavy and droopy. Just kind of a stalk-like little flower up on the top. There's several hyssops. I'm going to show you a couple others. Most of them are fall bloomers. I like them for their fragrance, for their texture, and for their interest. So let's get on with Black-Eyed Susan, Rudbeckia, very good border plant, 2 to 3 feet tall. This will spread. It's a rhizomatous spreader, so it sends out the rhizomes and it will continue to spread, but easy to control, not aggressive. Once a week type water. It's a zone 3 to 9. It is my indicator plant. If you have a moderate type irrigation zone, usually this is the first one to wilt. On the hot summer days, you'll know when it's time to water when your black-eyed Susans start to look a little droopy. And so I kind of term it, it's my termed indicator plant for moderate water zones. You watch the black-eyed Susan, and when it wilts, you water everything. And you kind of get in that pattern. You'll know it'll take, 4 or 5 or 6 days, depending on your soils, depending on other factors. You'll know that that's kind of the routine you're watering, maybe every 5 days or so. Throw in butterfly bush. It's actually a shrub that can be a perennial. This can get 10 to 12 feet tall. If you prune it, if you treat it like a shrub and you cut it to the ground every single year, it'll keep it short. Shorter, I should say, not short. It'll still put on, it can put on 4 or 5 feet of growth in a year. I've seen them grow 6 feet in a year. But to keep it nicer, more full, more perennial-like, I just cut it to the ground every single year. If you want a big shrub, you let it grow and it becomes a big shrub that can get a little rangy, but it attracts the butterflies, beautiful flowers, lots of range of color. I put it in the perennial section because if you treat it like a perennial, it's a big perennial, but you can treat it just like the perennials and cut them to the ground every single year, clean it up, and it fits for a good background, a structural something that gives good flower color and attracts some butterflies late in the fall. Missouri Evening Primrose. This is a very tough, very water-wise plant, beautiful flowers. I didn't put a lot of description on this one, but I will caution you, this one can spread by seed. It makes a little seed pod and then those pods break off and they're large, but they blow in the wind. They have these these little wings to them, these fins to them, and they can blow and get somewhere and they can spread by seed. Not super aggressively, but they can spread by seed. But otherwise, these are a nice looking perennial, really tough, very tolerant, fit very well in our climate. Sundrops, kind of similar to the Missouri Evening Primrose in color, but not nearly as kind of aggressive like that. So Sundrop is a native to Utah plant. It's 4 to 8 inches tall, 12 to 16 inches wide. Very low water once it's established, full sun. It's going to give you the great yellow into this, summer into fall. I put this in, it should maybe be in the late summer category, but it's blooming into fall, so I put it into there. Desert 4 o'clock. This one's also summer into fall. These are big plants. If you have an area that you need to cover lots of ground with very few plants, it's a big taproot type plant that's a tall ground cover. It's perennial 2 feet tall. I shouldn't say 2 feet tall. 14 inches to 2 feet tall is probably more like it. I've seen them, mine that I've grown historically are a foot to maybe 1.5 feet tall. It comes up from the base every spring, lush and green dark leaves, flowers midsummer into frost. When it's done in the frost, the top freezes, dries up, and it's like a tumbleweed. It'll sever itself from the taproot, and you can take that whole mass in one easy swoop, take it off, and dispose of it. I guess you could light it on fire, you could throw it away, you can recycle it into the landfill. It requires a lot of room. It can get 8 feet wide. I've grown these in park strips, and I end up trimming them off of the sidewalk and off of the curb. But they will fill up that 5-foot park strip super easy, and you're spreading them, 8 feet apart, and it'll just fill a park strip. On a hillside, these would do great. Very low water, very low need, kind of a very attractive but a big plant. Hummingbird flower or fire chalice, Zauschneria. This one, the late fall red, and it's low to the ground, perennial 12 inches. It does spread, it gets wider, not super aggressive. You see the picture that I put there at the bottom of one plant there that's kind of a mounded, a couple feet wide. Once a year cleanup is all that you need on this. The hummingbirds, before they are in their migratory thing, they're loving this. No water needed. It's a very tolerant plant of sun, of shade, of a little more water, a little less water. This won some award, I want to say it was last year or 2 years ago. Utah State did some stuff with the cultivation of this, and they couldn't keep it in stock at the nurseries because it was one of those like the plant of the year type things. It was a great plant, does very well here in our soils and our climate. Purple Dome Aster. There's lots of asters. I just put Purple Dome on here, but there's lots of them. You can see the list there at kind of at the bottom of the range of color. Asters are that good late summer, fall bloomer, taller perennial, kind of the typical aster shaped flower, but the range of colors. I like the deeper, darker asters. Kind of the old fashioned blue and white asters seem a little less formal, maybe a little weed-like to me. That's just personal preference. But these newer cultivations have fairly tight mound, tight habit, usually covered in blooms. These kind of go along with the mums. Your mums and your asters are going to bloom late in the fall, and they add that extra nice color to kind of carry into the fall leaf color and everything else. So really nice perennials. Sunset hyssop. I put sunset here but like I said, there's several hyssops. Great. I like these plants. They're one of my favorites because of just the way they look and the way they smell. These can be 12 to 24, even up to probably 3 feet tall, 18 to 24 inches wide, maybe even 3 feet wide. I got those numbers a little off there. I think they're more like 3 feet by 3 feet when mature. They bloom late summer and they'll bloom into frost. There's the sunset hyssop is the main big picture there, kind of the pinkish orange. They have, to me, the fragrance of licorice. Some people think they smell like root beer. And as you rub the foliage, this is sometimes referred to as anise hyssop because anise is the black licorice type. If you can taste black licorice, that's what this smells like. Part sun to full shade. Excuse me, I got that wrong. Full sun to part shade. This does best in full sun. Now, occasionally this will self-seed. And when they do, this is one of those, I like to dig up the little seedling and plant it somewhere else. Because this can be a perennial that doesn't live forever. It's best if you trim this one back in the spring because it does have some issues with getting frozen and water into the stems at the crown, which can kill the plant over winter. So I wait on these. Sometimes the snow breaks it down, the top down a little bit, but I would clean these up in the spring and then they'll regrow from the base and do just fantastic year to year. And again, the different colored stalks, the orange, the pinks, the deeper pinks, the blues. I think the hyssops are a great perennial for any yard. Texas hummingbird mint. this one goes right along with the other, the hyssops here. It's an Agastaki cana. It's the same type of thing. The close-up of the flower, close-up of the picture there, it's just another one of those hyssops that just has a different name. Some of them are referred to as the mints, but they're not a true mint like the herb mint or the aggressive salvia mints that we have here. Russian sage. Now we're about to the end here on some of these, and then we'll wrap this up with some questions. But Russian sage is one of those beautiful color, really intense color. This plant left undone can get rangy and a little out of control, and it's very strong in fragrance. If you have a bigger space, you can let it grow a little bit bigger, 3 to 4 feet tall. It does get shrubby, so I recommend cutting this thing completely to the ground every single year. Treat it like a true perennial. It attracts bees. If you have issues with bees, don't grow this one. You water it every 7 to 14 days or less. There is a shorter cultivation of this. It's supposed to get half the size and still have the nice blue, kind of that lavender blue color. You see these quite often, and they're great. They're a great tough plant, very fragrant. They have a lot of fragrance to them when you cut them and rub up against them and so forth. But I think they're great in a landscape in the right conditions. Every yard may not be suitable, but under the right conditions, this is a great one. Now, blue sage, this is one, you can see the plant there's not really dense. It just kind of taller spikes with blue flowers on the end. It's never going to form a very dense mounding shape. Easy to grow for blue stalk-like flowers. Not going to say too much more about that one. Full sun to light shade. Really tough water-wise. Blue mist spirea. This one's common. This is a Caryopteris, and there's a few different cultivations of this out there. Later fall into summer, late summer into fall bloomer, fragrant foliage, can get like a shrub. Some people leave these, they intentionally want these to be shrub-like. They get a little bit bigger, they can be 3 to 4 feet tall. Other people cut these way back every year and keep them small. But they're deer resistant, the bees love them. So that blue color in the fall, this is a great one. I have some of these in my yard and I love them. Because in the fall, with the grasses, the ornamental grasses and some of the other fall stuff, these are just a great look and a great feel for things that, at least in my opinion, they go really well with so many things. So I'm about to the end. This one, Santa Fe sunflower. Now, this one's a really, really tall plant, 6 to 8 feet tall, and that's all 1 year's growth. You cut these things to the ground, and it's all 1 year. So these are late fall bloomers. Sometimes these are blooming as the leaves are changing. You may not see the first bloom on this until late September, and sometimes even into October, depending on the year. Very low water, very tough. The mound does continue to get wider as it goes on, as it ages. Some of you that have come to other classes on when we talk about dividing perennials, you've taken little starts of this home because we've demonstrated how you can easily dig up the edges of this and separate it off. But as far as really late, very big, impressive, showy perennial, this one is definitely that for the fall. If you like that really late color, you need something of color and some height. Through the summer, it's growing and it gets taller and taller and taller, and it's just foliage. The foliage is not terrible. It still looks nice, but you're not going to get the flowers until very, very late fall. But worth considering if you have that kind of a room and that kind of space where you need that. But then when you cut it down, it's just empty in that space, again, until the next season when you've put on all that vegetative growth again. All right, so really quickly, I'm just going to go through a few ground covers, and then we're going to kind of wrap this up and take some questions. So just a few. Ice plant. This one's Mesa Verde, purple, dense forming, succulent, evergreen. Nice for rock gardens. Creeping thyme. Now the picture here, I'm showing a few different varieties of creeping thyme. There's pink chintz, there's red creeping thyme, there's the regular gray creeping thyme, there's elfin creeping thyme. There's several different varieties of these that will flower different colors at different times of the year and give you a little different texture. And these happen to be all grown together. This was at Jordan Valley's garden several years ago. But creeping thyme works as a great ground cover in between pavers, flagstones, some of that kind of stuff where you can walk on it a little, it doesn't hurt it stays very low to the ground. When it is flowering though, it does attract bees. You could step on a bee if you're barefoot. But I think these are a great ground cover for a fairly dense canopy. Some people use these as a lawn alternative. Notice when it's fully matured and filled in, it's still a little bumpy, but you don't need to mow it. You can be watered with spray irrigation. It could be watered with drip irrigation. This could be a lawn alternative if you really don't use your lawn other than a focal point that's flat and uniform in size, you know, as far as that designed area. So creeping thyme works well. Turkish veronica is another one that can be filled in mass. Does a little bit better in shade, in light shade. It's not the best in your hottest full sun space, but it does tolerate full sun, tolerates some shade. 1 to 2 foot of spread on each one, low growing, beautiful, kind of that darker bluish to purplish flower on it. So that's Turkish veronica, low grower, nice ground cover. Pink pussy toes, the Antenaria. The little flower looks like a cat's paw. Not super showy, but it's kind of grown for the ground cover and the gray-green foliage, but the flower is pink with that, it looks like the little shape of a cat's paw when you really look at them. So nice little ground cover, the flowers. Sedums, whole slew of sedums, range of height, color, texture, great succulent looking, good for rock gardens, borders. They bloom great in the fall. I mean, all of them will bloom. Some of them are grown for the blooms. Some of them are grown mostly just for the texture and the color of the foliage on the ground. But nice looking succulents that do super well for ground covers and borders and rock gardens and so forth. Some of them tolerate light shade. Most prefer full sun. Great perennials. I throw this one in here, creeping horehound. It doesn't have a lot. I don't have a lot of description on this, but very unique. Low water ground cover, fairly low mat forming, not mat forming, but you know, you're 6 to 8 inches tall. But the uniqueness of the leaf, the coloring and the texture is just worth growing. If you can look into that one, you may love to grow that one. It's grown in kind of drier, deserty, sandier soils. It can grow in any garden though. Snow in summer, very common. The white blooms, gray-green foliage, nice ground cover. And then hardy yellow ice plant, I've included the purple and the yellow here, but there are other colors. There's a white, there's I think one called fire spinner, that's an orange to reds. So there's quite a range now of ice plant, the hardy ice plants. If you come from California, you're probably used to the taller ice plants that grown along the freeways, they're kind of everywhere. These are not those. That particular variety is not hardy here in our climate, but these are lower growing, tight forming, evergreen. They do change color a bit in the fall, but nice succulent tight ground covers, again, for very dry spaces. Very little water needed on these. They do pretty well. Bugleweed, the bronzy to dark green foliage, and then they shoot up these little blue flower stalks. So quite short, but it's deer resistant. A very nice little ground cover, full to part shade on this one. Morning sun only. It's going to love your cooler spaces, but fast growing, easy to grow if you have that space under trees or under areas that need a ground cover in the shade. And prairie wine cups. This one, a little less formal. It does spread. It's more your single plant, but the foliage of it spreads across the ground. So it's not like a thyme or anything that kind of roots in as it goes. This one pops up. It's a perennial that pops up and spreads across the ground. So every year you're cleaning up all that vegetative material, and it'll regrow again the next year. But very drought tolerant, loves full sun. A summer bloomer, a little cup-shaped flower on that. It's great for very dry areas. Park strips, we've used this in park strips. Other dry areas, it's a great little perennial ground cover. And then if you need something taller, creeping Oregon grape is one. Full sun to part shade. You can see the 4 pictures there are all the same plant. It flowers yellow in the spring. It produces the blue edible berry. It turns the bronzy burgundy color in the fall, and then it's just the dark green foliage in the summer. So kind of an all year interest type of plant, but it's taller. It's 12 inches tall or taller, 12 inches plus. So this is a tall understory type plant. It will tolerate a bit of full sun. We have some of these in full sun. It's kind of one of those weird universal plants. It tolerates water, it tolerates a little bit of wet, it tolerates shade, it tolerates sun, and you get such an interest throughout the season. And plus, I said, those berries are edible. Some people make some different things out of those or use them. But an option for a tall ground cover. You see these sometimes as planted in mass, just areas that you really wouldn't be walking through much because they're taller, a little bit prickly. And I think this is going to wrap it up. Mulches, I throw this last thing in there. Mulches, you don't always need a perennial or plant to cover every surface. You can achieve color and texture and aesthetic interest and appeal simply by what's on the ground. So in your thinking of what's to be in your yard, what you're planting, what you're not planting, and so forth, sometimes it's okay to have a little bit of empty space. And then what you do in that empty space can still provide the interest or color or texture that helps accentuate or pop something else out. Simple bark can do that. Different types of crushed rock material can do that. I listed on here grass clippings and nutshells. In different parts of the country, they use pine needle mulches, pine needle straws, what they call it. What you put on the ground can really help accentuate the interest and the color and the feel. And it doesn't need any water, it doesn't need anything, but it will retain water, or it can break down and add to soil nutrients. It can do a lot. So always think about mulching. If you can, if it's possible, add mulch to your soils, and it'll increase, it'll do a lot for the plants, moderate soil temperatures, moderates moisture temperatures. But again, I say it can create the aesthetic appeal of what is also happening in your landscape. And then I think this is the last slide I threw in here before some questions. We're not going to talk about grasses. I only threw grasses up here. Grasses is a whole separate topic, but they fit with perennials. I would encourage you to look at ornamental grasses that can be grown with your perennials, because they provide, again, color and texture and interest that some of your flowering plants won't ever provide. And they're super easy. Once a year, you cut them to the ground and you're done. Very tolerant of so many things. They don't need much. And they range from your little teeny fescue grasses of a few inches tall to the giant Ravenna that's 14 feet tall. So you can achieve some very cool things using grasses for the texture and the height and the color. And I think with that is my last slide. But before I jump to the questions and get Janice on here, I want to remind everybody that's still on that we will have some good upcoming classes coming the rest of this month through the month of May. And so before I forget to say those, we'll do an irrigation kind of repair and maintenance, we'll do localscapes, we'll do containers. We're going to do constructing a raised bed class and a succulents class, all coming up in May, and then we're going to see how things go. And if we need to continue to do these, we'll continue with some different ones into June. But with that, I think I'll just jump over to some questions. Janice, if you're on, jump right in any time.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so there were a couple of questions. I've been trying to answer them as we went along, but there were a couple I didn't know the answers to. And then there was one question that several people asked, and it was about how do you know what USDA hardiness zone you're in?
Okay, that's a great question. I probably should have covered that at the very beginning. If you just do a little Google search for USDA hardiness zones, you'll see a map. You'll be able to have it'll just show you a national map, or you can even get a Utah USDA hardiness zone map, and it'll show you the zones by map. And generally speaking, if you're along the Wasatch Front, and they've changed some of the zones, but we're like considered a zone 5A or 5B, or sometimes even a 6, which means anything that's a zone 5, 6 plant will grow and do fine here, or anything less. The 4s, the 3s, the 2s, all of those will do fine here. If you live up in the higher mountain valleys, you may actually be a zone 3 or 4. Or if you're up into Park City, it could be even a 2 to 3, depending on where you live, which means your zone 5 plants won't do that well in those places. So definitely look on those maps. I don't have the specific website, but if you just do a Google search, you will find a hardiness zone map, and then you'll be able to know which zone you're in.
Yeah, I did send a link to a couple of questions, and you can actually search with your zip code. And so you can really narrow it down.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
I'm seeing there's a question here about putting weed barrier between the ground and the mulch. That is also a great question. My personal experience is no. I don't like to use weed barrier between the ground and the mulch unless you're mulching with rock and you really intend to not ever change up that landscape much. Because as soon as you start changing things up, you're cutting holes in it and you're just making this giant work for yourself. In addition to, if you put an organic mulch on top of the fabric, that organic mulch is breaking down. And after just a couple of years, you have a very fertile layer of material on top of the fabric. And it only takes a couple of years and pretty much your fabric is now useless anyway. Weeds are germinating in the fertile layer, they're growing, you're fighting because those weeds are now rooting into the fabric. And besides that, you're kind of restricting some things around the base of plants, as plants are supposed to grow wider. If you only have this little teeny hole, I would recommend no, other than maybe for some rock mulches that are very sparsely planted. And we've done that. We've done fabric under rock mulch, but in a heavily planted perennial bed, I'd say if weeds are a problem, use some pre-emergence, get out there and weed a bit, but I would avoid using the weed barrier myself. That's just my experience. So there's also, let's see, Janice, you might be able to help me with this one. Recommending some perennials for cut flower bouquets besides Shasta Daisy.
Yeah, so there's a bunch that do really well. I was just looking on my other computer I taught a class, I think it was 2 years ago, and had a really good list of plants that do good in our area that you can turn around and use for cut flowers. I don't see it up there. We got a new website, but is it something that we could just post, Dave?
Yeah, we can post a list.
That?
Yeah, if you have that list, we can easily post it on the same page that has the registration page. Under the presentations, we can post a PDF file there or something that lists cut flowers.
Yeah.
We were going to do a cut flower class, and anyway, but Janice, if you have that list, we can easily get it posted.
Yeah, so look for that tomorrow if you can. And then before you move on with any other ones, there was one question that I didn't know the answer to, so I told them that I would ask. So someone has an issue. They've got an insect on their coral bells that seem to have been eaten at the roots. The plant suffers. The one has come back, and another I've dug up and I'm nursing along. The roots look like they're full of insect droppings, brown granular looking stuff and full of holes. Do you know what that is? Is that root weevil? Is that strawberry root weevil?
It could be. Without seeing it, it's sometimes hard to tell. Slugs will sometimes do some damage. I've never seen the little pellet things, but slugs can do
to the roots. Yeah, to the roots.
It could be the root weevil. Maybe email us a picture of that. And if we don't know, we can ask our colleagues at Utah State Extension.
Yeah.
And we could probably get an answer. So email that to either Janice or myself. I think our emails are right below. My email is right below my picture. Janice's email is jterry@weberbasin.com. So send us a picture of that and we'll try to identify what that is and get back with you. Should we try that? Because it's hard to tell without seeing that firsthand. There could be a couple of different things. So let me see, we have a cabin in the Uintas, manzanita everywhere. Will it grow down here in the valley? Great question. Yes, it will. Certain manzanita will grow here in the valley. There are a few varieties of manzanita and it's a great plant. So finding it may be the challenge. Look around first, go to the nurseries and ask about it. There are growers. We've talked to some wholesale growers before at the UNLA Green conferences. There are growers that are growing various cultivations of manzanita and they're beautiful. For those that don't know what manzanita is, it's a shrub. It's a very hardy, tough shrub. It does flower, but it's a beautiful shrub. That grows in the mountains in the wild here in Utah. There's some different manzanitas in southern Utah than that you would find in the Uintas, but ask at the nurseries and you can probably find one. Or you do a couple little Google searches and you may be able to mail order the variety of manzanita that would do well at the zone 5 or zone 6 level. But great question. What is meant by cutting back perennials? When do you do it? Should we always do that? I did not know you were supposed to do that. So when I talk about cutting them back, most perennials are vegetative. It has vegetative growth, meaning everything that grows up from the crown of the plant, that's all going to die. That material is dead. The root and the crown are very much alive, but everything that grows up is dead. So to cut it back means you're taking all that dead material and you're just cutting it off or pulling it off. Some perennials are super easy. That dead material, you don't even have to cut it. You just pull on it in the spring or the fall and it's all coming off. And it's almost like the perennial disappears. Other perennials, they may not die all the way. They may have a floret of foliage at the base and just the top is dead. And so you go in and you cut off all of the top growth that's turning brown, that's unsightly. So you should do that. Anything that's dead or unsightly, you cut it off. And you usually do that once a year, either spring or fall, whenever you have the time. And as I mentioned, some perennials prefer to be cut back in the spring. It's when they haven't really come alive yet, but they've been protecting themselves through the winter so they don't have winter damage. And then you go clean up all the dead material in the early spring before it starts growing again. So you can do spring or fall. That's a little different than deadheading. Deadheading is simply cutting off the spent flowers. So you don't go way, way down on those. Usually you're just going into the foliage just a little bit. But that's what it means to cut back a perennial. So I hope that answered that. If not, ask another follow-up question and we'll address that. Let's see, the next one, I have a sage that is dead, that has a dead leaf on steel. Do I trim it? Usually, yes. If it has anything dead on it, perennials are usually tough enough. If there's a little bit of dead one way or another somewhere on it, you can usually go in and trim those up and tidy them up a bit, and you're just fine. You don't have to worry about the whole plant, but you could trim one bit of that plant halfway back, cut the dead part off, and the rest will be just fine. If it's still got a little bit of dead, definitely trim it off, tidy it up a little bit, and it'll be fine. So thanks for that question. Let's see. Let me scroll down a little bit. Oak fabric weedberry again. Hostas were trying to poke through it, and it was a pain to cut it away yesterday. That was just a follow-up probably to my comment. Yes, weedberry fabric can create some of those issues. It makes it a challenge with those perennials that are trying to spread a little bit and widen out. Pros and cons, but I usually just would rather go with a pre-emergent and a mulch, a good mulch, and you're going to be better off. So from Lynn, most of the plants seem to need to need some sun. Could you recommend some for full shade? So I had some of those for full shade. Janice, right off the top of your head, do you have some good, just a few full shade ones?
Yeah, so I was answering questions mostly during your class, but hostas are always a good standby. They're not super showy. Astilbes are a shade plant in our area. They do amazing, and they like to have it a little more moist. Coral bells you talked about. Meadow rue is a really pretty one that I like. And Helleborus is a favorite. Helleborus is one of my favorite all-time perennials. It's an evergreen. It doesn't die back all the way to the ground every year, but it's a good one. And those start blooming the end of February. And they'll stay blooming all year.
And I had talked about a couple in the presentation. The coral bells, they're great for full shade. The columbines are great for full shade. And there's quite a few little ground covery filling in type plants that are also great for full shade. I mean, if you like a really aggressive spreader, you could grow something like bishop's weed. It wasn't in my presentation, but that will definitely fill in spaces, and it loves full shade. I talked about one of the cranesbill geraniums. There's a couple other geraniums like that do quite well in shade and dry shade.
Yeah, plumbago is another good one, hardy plumbago. I feel like there's not a ton of shade plants that are super showy with their flowers either. I don't know. They're not as showy as like most of the sun perennials, but there are some good ones.
Yeah, there are. And we're not going to be able to go through the entire list, but there are some lists online. I think USU Extension has a good shade list where they put on some good, slides and different things. Not slides, but a list of good shade perennials. But as Jen has mentioned, most of your shade perennials, they're grown not necessarily for their color of flower. A lot of the shade perennials are foliage and texture plants. They're not putting on some giant show of flowers because of the environment that they thrive in, which is shade. It's mostly their kind of natural understory plants. And so you're not going to get really full flowering shade plants typically. They're more foliage, they're understory, they're interesting color in that way. So kind of that may help you out a little bit. Let's see, slugs. Let's talk about slugs. I have slugs with nematodes. Oh, will nematodes kill them? Janice, do you know?
I think that's one of those things you're going to have to do some research, because most plants, or not plants, but insect pests, if a nematode or some kind of biological control is going to take care of them, the nematode is very specific to the pest, right, Dave? So
Yeah.
It's not like if you put out a general nematode, it's going to go just kill all the bad insects. It's like most of them are specific to a different pest. So I don't know. I can't think of any nematodes off the top of my head that are for slugs. I haven't heard any, but Utah State, once again, we talk about them a lot because they're such a good resource in the area. But at their pest website, that's probably the best place to see if that's an option for slugs.
Yeah, slugs are a tough one. I've only really used, I know it's maybe not the best, but sometimes you just have to resort to some sort of an insecticide. And in this case, a slug to me is an insect, and there are slug baits and different things. And I've used some of those to control slugs, but I really don't know of the other options. I really haven't done enough research on it. I guess it's not interesting enough to me. I should probably spend a little more time. I haven't ever been plagued with slug problems so badly that I've done, I've really dove into the research there, but I've used some different, the little slug pellets and sprinkle them on the edge somewhere, and they seem to do fine that way. But if you have a major slug problem, I would do what Janice said, get online, do a little research. There may be a nematode or an organic method of, some sort of other pest that deals with the slugs, but I don't know for sure. Okay, is there a rule of thumb about ratio of perennials per foot in a bed? There is no rule of thumb. It all has to do with the perennial itself, how big they're going to be at maturity. And you can pack a bed as full of perennials as you want. If you don't want to see the ground at all, you could put enough perennials in there that you won't ever see the ground. Or if you like things a little more sparse, you just need to know the mature sizing of things. But there is really no rule of thumb that I know. Janice, do you have any recommendations if you're designing or?
No, I don't.
It's just, you just have to know enough about the plant and its mature size, and then you space them accordingly. But that could be all over the place. Everybody's preferences are different. So I hope that helps, but it doesn't give you probably the answer you're looking for. Question from Hera. I'm from the deep south where ferns were abundant. What ferns do well here with part sun? Oh, I wished I knew the varieties. I should have thrown a couple in here. I don't know the specific varieties, but I know there are a few varieties that do well here in our climate. Janice, do you know them?
I can't think off the top of my head, but from what I understand, most of them don't want the sun though, right? They're all pretty deep shade, right, Dave?
They want mostly shade, but if I think it depends on the site. Part sun meaning, okay. Maybe I should have asked this. Part sun, if it's getting a little bit of morning sun, I think it would be just fine. But if it's the hot afternoon sun, your ferns here, whatever even grows here, would not do well. I think it's a little bit of early sun would be fine on them when it's cooler part of the day. But I cannot remember. Again, that's another plant we haven't grown a lot. I've never grown them personally, so I'm not sure what specific varieties there are. But there are people that have ferns here and they grow them. You just have to do a little asking maybe at the nurseries or do a little searching online. Sorry, that didn't answer that the best either, but it is possible, so don't give up. Comment, beer can work with slugs, puts them in a flat pan. I have also heard that. They're attracted to that from the smell. They go in, they drown. And so that can work for slugs if you're continuing to fight slug problems. I've heard you can do that. Yeah, ideally you're putting that kind of at ground level. You just dig it in a little bit, or like you said, a flat pan where they can get into that slugs and they'll drown. So I've heard that works great. Let's see. Any other questions that I missed?
I don't have any. I think we might be good.
I think that might be all. The last comment was we registered for LocalScape, but the class was canceled. Yeah, anybody that's registered for classes that were canceled, we'll try to do some online versions. If it's still not what was originally planned, we're figuring that out. and we hope to offer those. There will be a few local scape classes online coming up. The workshop style like design, we haven't figured that one out yet to make it as effective as we want to make it, but we're thinking about how we can do that. But keep looking on our website, keep looking on our social media stuff, and we will continue to post material there and information about what's upcoming. But we're hoping that sooner than later, we might be able to get back to hosting some classes at our site again in our classroom, and having some of you come to some of those workshops there, but we don't know how long that might be. So let's see, I guess one last question was, what are we building? Probably at our site, it was a new learning education building, research center. It is now finished. And then the garden's just being re-landscaped now, and we're just at the tail end of that. But it was a building to accommodate more community education, more community research related to water resources, and water conservation going forward with the way things are going, population growth, with water supply. So we're in the process of just ramping things up to provide more education and more opportunities for education there at our site. And a question about our garden fair this year, the answer is no. We had planned on doing a garden fair, but with the coronavirus issues going on, June 6th is going to come very quickly. We're really only like 5 weeks, well, not quite 5, maybe a little over 5 weeks away from that. So our administration is no, we're not planning to do the garden fair as normally planned, but we're looking at doing a possible fall event. Well, we're planning a fall event, and we may do a different later summer something event in addition to what we had planned on our class schedule. So look for those things. We'll try to do things as we can. But we appreciate everybody participating with us today, and your questions, and being willing to take a minute in the middle of the day. We know the timing may not be great for everybody, which is why we're recording these. So if you know somebody that could benefit from this, it'll be posted on our website. They can go and review that at their own time, and look forward to having you join us at our next ones. So thank you, everybody. And I think with that, we're gonna end this, and we'll see you all next week, we hope.